Oh, wow, house lights come up. That means I'm starting, and my mic is live. Thanks. Everybody loves being the presentation after lunch, right? Well, welcome to our presentation. I'm Grace Rink. I am with AECOM. We are a large architecture and engineering consulting firm, and I am neither an architect nor engineer. I work in the climate policy space, and we are here today with the City of Aspen, which is one of our clients who we're working with right now. And I am really just your MC for today. Kind of like Raleigh, at some point I get to start throwing these boxes around, which will be fun. So thank you again for joining us. This is our agenda, just so you know what we're going to be going through, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. We're obviously going to introduce our panelists first. We're going to then the folks at Aspen are going to give you an overview of their climate plans or climate goals, which for many of you are probably going to be somewhat similar to the goals your cities have as well. Allison is going to describe the cost analysis and our key considerations. We're going to go through the 3 top subjects that we're working on, not to say that there aren't other issues that Aspen is working on, but these are the ones we'll focus on today. We're going to talk about funding options. Everybody always wants to talk about funding options. I mean, that's the entire point of this project, is to figure out exactly what is it going to cost for Aspen to implement its climate plan. And then finally, Aspen will close us out by talking about next steps. And so first, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Tim Karfs.
Hi, everyone. Tim Karfs, Sustainability Program Administrator at the City of Aspen.
Hi, everyone. Ainsley Brosnan-Smith, Sustainability Administrator.
Hi, Allison Nemero, Principal in the Sustainable Economics Practice at AECOM.
Hi, everyone. I'm Clare McLaughlin, Sustainability Administrator at the City of Aspen.
And Claire, I think, it goes over to you, Ainsley. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. So how did we get to the point where we hired on AECOM to analyze the costs it will take to reach our climate action goals? Well, for one, we are feeling the impacts of climate change in Aspen already. Since the 1980s, we've been increasing the amount of frost-free days we have been experiencing. So since the 1980s, we have lost an entire month of snow or winter. To address this, our City Council has adopted the Paris Climate Agreement science-based targets to limit global warming potential below 1.5 degrees Celsius. These specific goals and reductions we've adopted are 64% reduction in emissions by 2030 and 100% emissions reductions by 2050.
Oops.
So to reach those goals that Ainsley talked about, our City Council adopted our Aspen Sustainability Action Plan, or ASAP. And that's basically a roadmap full of policies and actions that we need to do in order to reach those goals. So from construction and demolition, waste mitigation, to electrifying our fleets, decarbonizing our buildings, we have a lot to do in that roadmap in order to achieve those goals. So we get to work with AECOM to figure out, all right, given all those policies and actions, what are going to be the real costs and opportunities to achieving that, to actually seeing the roadmap through? And this is going to help us in a few ways. So first, being able to name the costs and benefits and potential funding mechanisms for our climate policies is going to help us be better, clearer, more transparent communicators about what it's going to take to reach our climate goals.
No.
Second,
I did not change the slide. I don't know why it's advancing.
Second, it's going to help us support our elected officials. It's going to help them be able to think about and weigh trade-offs and prioritize. And third, it's going to help us meet community where they're at. So if we understand the true costs and benefits of different policies, we can actually meet the community with adequate resources and supports and ensure that any programming is really feasible moving forward. So to that end, this study is not just looking at costs and benefits, but also, given those costs, how are we going to fund it? And that's probably the most exciting part. And this is definitely interesting coming from Aspen, where we're really fortunate. We already have a lot of funding streams. We have a short-term rental tax. We've got the Renewable Energy Mitigation Program. We've got our general fund. We've got our plastic bag fees. We are very fortunate. Yet, we still know to reach that big Aspen Sustainability Action Plan, we're probably going to need more. And so that's why this study is so important, to empower us to kind of see those policies through.
So now we can advance, right?
Now we can advance.
I think it just doesn't like when we're hanging on to one slide for too long, but.
So Clare and Ainsley talked about why the need for this study, and I'm going to give an overview of what it is we're doing. And spoiler alert, we're not going to share any numbers today because we are in the final stages of wrapping up the analysis. But I am going to talk about what we're doing and some of the sort of qualitative findings that have emerged as we go through sector by sector. So first of all, the city chose 10 actions for analysis that align with the three sectors that together make up more than 80% of the citywide emissions as, captured in the greenhouse gas inventory. And so we're conducting a quantitative cost-benefit analysis for about 6 of those actions. The first is the Building IQ program, which is a benchmarking and building performance standard. The second is a low to no emissions building code. In the transportation sector, we're looking at both community-wide and municipal fleet electrification, including the charging infrastructure required. And then in the solid waste sector, we're looking at construction and demolition debris diversion, as well as organic waste diversion. And then we're qualitatively considering about 3 or 4 other actions that are also really critical, but for a variety of reasons are a little bit harder, don't make a lot of sense quite yet to do the cost-benefit analysis for. So that includes considering embodied carbon in building codes, which it's such early days for that we think it's a little bit premature to start figuring out what the cost implications would be, as well as single hauler waste servicing, which we've talked about some of the next steps that would be required if the city wants to go in that direction. And then kind of underlying all of this is what needs to happen with the electric grid in terms of modernization in order to allow this to happen, which is frankly a really, really big question that we think may possibly warrant its own future study in partnership with the local utilities.
Okay, now
we can go to the next slide. Okay. So the structure of our analysis, we're looking at life cycle costs, so both the upfront capital investment required to achieve the action, and then what are the long-term operating maintenance costs, in some cases energy savings, through 2050. We're considering the availability of federal tax incentives, as that's sort of like somebody else is paying for that portion. But we're being otherwise fairly agnostic as to who will bear the cost. And that's really to support the conversation that Claire was talking about, which is like, what will the cost be, allowing the city to then have a conversation with private building owners, private fleet owners, like how much can you bear? Are there opportunities for the city to support? And then finally, in addition to doing that operational cost, the life cycle cost analysis in terms of just direct costs, savings, and operating and maintenance expenditures, we're also looking at the benefits of greenhouse gas reduction to society using the US EPA's social cost of carbon, which is an estimate, and we can talk more about it, but it's an estimate of the total cost to society per metric ton of greenhouse gas reduced. And I think Tim's going to add on a little bit about the value of that.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that these sort of additional key performance indicators like the social cost of carbon are going to be essential for us to strengthen the sort of arguments that we're making in support of our climate action policies. We know that those climate action policies are essential for us to decarbonize our economy. But what I think is going to be difficult moving forward is just to kind of convey that message to leadership and to the community of why that is seriously important, why we're making these decisions within our work. So the social cost of carbon is a great indicator for us to use just to kind of build out and bulk out just of some of the great benefits of this style of work.
Okay, so there was a little ghost in the machine. So now we're going to go to the old school style, and I say, next slide, please. There we go.
Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go through kind of our big areas of inquiry or analysis and put a little bit more meat on them. Allison alluded to each of them before. So the first one is kind of underpins a lot of our work, and that's our energy system. And we are very lucky here. Our utilities, our local electricity providers make our jobs a lot easier. We work with Holy Cross Energy, who will be 100% renewable by 2030. We also work with our local municipal Aspen utilities, and they've been 100% renewable since 2015. So what this tells us is that electrification is really the way forward. So the analysis here is really understanding, okay, if electrification, then what? What are the costs? What do we need to think about when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to rates, when it comes to equity to ensure that we're ready for that transition moving forward? Now, as Allison said, this is a big one. And so instead of having kind of really discrete cost benefits of like what infrastructure is going to cost, what we've done is we have kind of a roadmap of the next steps of key analyses that will probably take the next several years. And we're using that roadmap to really guide conversations with our utilities so that we're on the same page. And when we do move into those studies, we're doing it as a team and as together. And we think that that will be the most successful way forward.
Oh, next slide.
Building decarbonization. So the next few we're going to go into, we are going a little bit more in detail with our analysis and our numbers. So building decarbonization in Aspen is pretty interesting. It's 57% of our emissions come from the built environment in Aspen. And so we address this through kind of a three-pronged approach. So we have our policies and our incentives, and we have partnerships. So on the policy side, we have to deal with our new buildings and we have existing buildings. So for new buildings, we use really progressive building and energy codes. And then for our existing buildings, as Allison mentioned, we have our Building IQ program, which is benchmarking and the development of a building performance standard. On the incentive side, we give out grants and rebates, and we really do that through partnership. So on partnership, we have a very long-standing and amazing collaboration with the Community Office of Resource Efficiency, or CORE, who's actually at this conference, and they help give out both the grants and rebates, but also technical advising and support, which is really helpful for building owners and tenants. And then we also have other partnerships with people like APSHA, who's our kind of affordable housing entity. So a lot going on in order to decarbonize buildings, and in those policies and actions, we have realized some challenges. So in the building space, cost is a real one. So both capital and operational costs, and then also when you put an equity lens on it. So understanding how do people kind of bear those costs differently, and especially in the wake of a housing affordability crisis, like how do you balance these tensions of costs of housing and costs of building and costs of retrofits. Another challenge is our technical and logistical feasibility. So we're climate zone 7, which is really cold, high altitude, probably like most people at this conference. And that means that some of the technology that we need might be more expensive or less available. And also on the technology front, we happen to be a very boiler-heavy town, which is unfortunate because boilers tend to be the most expensive and logistically challenging to switch out at this point technologically. It is possible, but it just has more barriers. And then logistic challenges are space, right? Our lots are built out kind of lot line to lot line. So it's like, where are you gonna put the transformer? Where are you putting the condensing unit? Like, these are real questions we're dealing with as we retrofit in Aspen. And then finally is kind of workforce and who's gonna do this work and how are we gonna be prepared for that change.
Next slide, please.
Oh.
Yeah, that's still you.
Yeah, still me. So in our analyses, one cool part was, so as Allison said, we analyzed both like building codes, but also our Building IQ policy. And just to mention here, we're part of the National BPS Technical Assistance Network, and through that partnership, we're actually able to partner with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and Pacific Northwest National Labs. So they're actually the ones doing this cost-benefit analysis, and then we're actually gonna take that work, feed it to AECOM, and then AECOM's gonna do the more funding, kind of innovative financial instrument side of that. So this is just another cool partnership, part of this project.
Next slide, please.
So in the meantime, we're focusing at AECOM on the code analysis. And again, we're sort of wrapping up the final numbers, but I wanted to share some of the qualitative findings that are emerging that I think might be of interest. So the first, Claire already alluded to, but the impacts of some of the specifics of the mountain town context on the costs and the technological solutions, things that frankly drive up the upfront cost required. So Claire talked about the impact of being in climate zone 7, high labor costs, high cost of just getting the materials up to Aspen and to other mountain towns. Another factor is the prevalence of large single-family homes and other buildings with luxury amenities, say outdoor pools, spas, in-ground snowmelt, that really drive up energy use and require more upfront investment to electrify. The second kind of interesting finding, again, Clare talked about how the grid is on its way to 100% renewable, so electrification from a greenhouse gas reduction perspective is certainly the answer. However, what we've seen in Aspen is that a lot of workforce housing providers, for example, will provide electric resistance heat because it's a cheaper upfront cost. And yes, like technically that does achieve the city's greenhouse gas emissions goals. However, it's also really expensive to operate. And so you end up passing along the cost to the tenants. And so one of the benefits of doing this quantification analysis is we can demonstrate the really critical importance of investing in heat pumps, high efficiency heat pumps, which have a higher upfront cost, but then benefit tenants in the long term. And then finally, I think it's pretty clear that residents and property owners are very likely to bear most of the costs of retrofits in most communities, at least given the incentives that we have in place. You know, qualitatively, the IRA tax credits, for example, people are starting to take advantage of them, but they don't offset the whole cost by any means. They're just like an added, benefit. And so it's, I think, going to be helpful to quantify that in order for the city to be able to have a conversation. As Claire mentioned, CORE, a local nonprofit, has been able to provide additional grants and incentives up front to help catalyze the first round of projects. And then this analysis is going to set up a discussion about, how should costs be divided going forward.
All right, so thanks, Claire and Allison. We're going to move to Tim with transportation. Next slide, please.
Yeah, wonderful. Transportation, everyone I think in this room is pretty familiar with some of the traffic congestion issues we have in our mountain towns. And that traffic congestion is a result of increasing cost of living in our communities and the increasing distances that our workforce is commuting up to Aspen and like communities across the mountain region. We are really fortunate in Aspen to have a partner like the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority, RAFTA. It's a public transportation authority that can shuttle our workforce up and down the valley into some valleys a little bit adjacent to that as well. And we also have really prioritized investment in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. But we know that buses and bikes and walking to Aspen is not always going to work out, and that it is necessary for some people to drive. So our goal is definitely to support the conditions for people to electrify. And that's both through public charging infrastructure and then also through leading by example with electrifying the City of Aspen fleet as well. On the public charging infrastructure side, I think we've got a highly regulated and complex and dense environment in Aspen that, the projects that we propose kind of just, I was looking for examples, and I think it's like downtown New York City, Manhattan. It's just like on curb, and it's in the public right-of-way, and it just makes for a really complicated and relatively costly installation process. But we know that this is an essential process because not everyone has access to charging in their private home or garage, So this is what we see as a really great equity benefit of sharing the benefits of electric transportation with our community as well. It's an essential feature of that. And then on the fleet side, we are looking to tackle the challenges of fleet electrification in the mountains through Climate Zone 7, through undulated and elevated highways. We've got it all up there in Aspen. So we're trying to tackle those issues head on and hopefully before our community, so we can kind of share the lessons learned of what it takes to electrify a fleet that's comprised of a bunch of different equipment and vehicles, and that's just a necessary process. And I think just the final thing to add is that Aspen Police Department is just a shining signal of what it looks like to electrify. We've got a third of the police force currently being electric, and I think it is the first thing that people kind of see when they look to the city to municipal government doing these sustainability projects. It's very shiny. New EV is a very big symbol of what it takes and what the city's doing to actually implement our climate goals.
Next slide, please.
So a few observations from the transportation cost analysis. First of all, I think it's really important to note that for passenger vehicles at least, we're expecting EVs to reach price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles, like maybe by 2026. We're really close. And so then the question becomes, there may be real price savings for drivers, depending, of course, on the complicated question of what happens with electric rates versus gasoline prices. So we may need to do some sensitivity testing to really get our arms around what that's going to look like, because there's some unknowns. It's also important to note that electric or zero-emission bus, heavy-duty vehicles, off-road equipment, in some cases, well, first, for things like electric buses, they're still much more expensive than the traditional diesel alternative. And the avoided fuel savings don't yet outweigh that upfront cost, particularly when you consider the need for the charging infrastructure, often new bus facilities that are going to be required. For some of the off-road equipment, there isn't even really a commercially viable alternative yet, although certainly things are in pilot phase. So there are unknowns that we cannot necessarily quantify, but that we can sort of point towards as things that the city will need to keep an eye on going forward. Tim mentioned that the city's most important tool for facilitating community transition is installing charging infrastructure, so that's definitely part of our analysis. And one of the things that has been really interesting is to think about the electric rate structure and how that impacts the payback period. So, for example, we've had some conversations with Aspen Electric about demand charges, which really impact level 3 chargers downtown. It makes charging a lot more expensive for those users. On the other hand, from an equity perspective, somebody has to be paying for the cost of that electricity. And if it's, the argument is, well, if folks are driving up from Denver in their Teslas or their Rivians, shouldn't they be paying a bit more to charge downtown? So we can keep rates lower for ratepayers in the city. So there's some really interesting equity conversations that you also start to get into when you think about this from a cost-benefit perspective.
All right, great, thanks. And wait, how'd I go the wrong way? It's back to me now. Okay, over to Ainsley.
Next, we'll talk about waste. So waste is our third largest emissions sector, and that's 16% of Aspen's emissions. And to reduce those emissions, we want to focus on the resources that we are landfilling, like the most commonly landfilled materials, and that is organic waste and construction and demolition waste. To achieve our organics goals, we actually passed a policy a year ago that states all organic material must be prohibited or is prohibited from the landfill. So right now, all of our restaurants are composting. This type of policy, we believe, is going to keep us on track for an organics reduction of 25% by 2025 and 100% by 2050. The next one is construction and demolition waste, and that makes up over half of what Aspen throws away in our local landfill. So Aspen is rapidly developing, and people want their houses and their hotels built yesterday. And that is creating practices like scrape and replace, where you demolish and you start building immediately, and there's no diversion or recycling of materials, because that does take a little longer to separate out. We are hopeful that we can have some sort of ordinance or policy in place that encourages or regulates the recycling of those materials. So by 2030, we want to see a reduction in 50% of that C&D debris, and then 80% by 2050. Our overall waste goals are a 70% reduction by 2050. Challenges we face specifically with organics reduction are bears. We already have bears going in our trash, and we want to make sure that we are promoting practices that keep the public safe and the wildlife safe. So we want to avoid things like that on the screen from happening. So we're using really specialized containers to make sure bears can't get into them. As Claire and Tim have said, we are a very dense population and building area where we're built lot line to lot line. So sometimes having the dumpsters to separate out materials does create a lot of dumpsters on top of each other as we try to get like the concrete and the asphalt and the metal separated from those building development areas. Service limitations, we're in the middle of the mountains. Sometimes weather events prevent trucks from getting up and emptying those containers, so we got to keep an eye out for that. And then lastly, the marketplace availability. Given our local context, we don't have the luxury of reuse marketplaces like we might see in Denver and on the Front Range, where there's more of an urban population, more land to build those facilities for selling out those building and construction materials. So we're really focusing on the recycling of like concrete and asphalt and metals. Those are things that we have locally available to us right now, and hopefully one day we can have more reuse markets.
So from a cost perspective, some really interesting findings, and a benefits perspective, some interesting findings are starting to emerge. So the first is, Ainsley's talked about how solid waste represents 16% of Aspen's greenhouse gas emissions, which is like crazy high compared to most communities I work in. And maybe the other mountain towns, some of the folks here have similarly high percentages. I think it represents the impact of the tourism economy, because in many cities that I work in, we consider waste kind of an afterthought from an inventory perspective. And so that 16% doesn't even include the embodied carbon impacts, which are the impacts of the life cycle, the total greenhouse gas emissions from production through construction. And that's really important when you're thinking about construction and demolition debris. What are those like embodied carbon impacts? There was some initial concern, and I think this is going to be an issue that continues to come up, that the increased number of trucks on the road to help, take the different bins, the organics, the separated construction and demolition waste, would that outweigh the greenhouse gas benefits of the policies? And our analysis is showing no, like the trucking is not going to outweigh the benefits from a greenhouse gas perspective, so that's really great news. Ainsley's already talked about some of the specific considerations for mountain town programs, specifically those bear-proof organics receptacles. Where are you going to find them? And they're pretty expensive. So for the organics, the first phase of the organics diversion, the City of Aspen was able to pay for those restaurants. It was like a total cost of $200,000? Over $200,000 to subsidize the restaurants in getting those bear-proof receptacles. So what's, quantifying that cost as the program expands is going to help the city think about, to what extent can they continue to subsidize and how best to allocate those subsidies. And it really bugs me that I spelled it receptables, but you know what I was getting at. And then finally, one of the really interesting things has been the level of detail that we need to get at from a policy perspective in order to think about the costs. And so I'm really hopeful it's going to be helpful, some of the conversations that we have started as the city thinks through policy. So for example, we talked to several contractors in Aspen about how they deal with their waste and what would be the impacts of expanding construction and demolition debris diversion. And it turns out that steel and concrete are, from their perspective, relatively easy to separate. But when you start looking at lumber, it has nails in it, and you have to get the nails out. And that can be a manual process that's super expensive. There's one fellow in Aspen who's invested in a multi-million-dollar machine to grind up the lumber, and I don't know, maybe he removes the nails magnetically, I'm not sure. So he's taken an upfront cost to reduce the labor cost. But the lumber is also where most of the emissions are coming from. And so getting that final percentage is going to be the nut that's hard to crack, that I think is going to be a topic of continued conversation going forward. So now I'm going to talk about funding. Once we have these costs, how are we going to pay for them? And as Claire talked about, the City of Aspen is incredibly fortunate to have dedicated funding for climate action, including the Renewable Energy Mitigation Program, or REMP, which requires building owners with exterior loads, so for example, heating for spas, for pools, for in-ground snowmelt, for heat tape, to either provide an equivalent amount of renewable energy on site or to pay a fee. So that's one funding source. There's also the short-term rental tax, which isn't even accounted for here yet because it's so new. But the climate department is also getting regular transfers from electric and water utility funds and from the general fund. So unusually fortunate to be relatively flush with cash, but we're also finding that that's not sufficient. And so what are we going to be looking at in the long term? Next slide. Are really these three, what I like to categorize into three buckets. So the first is external funding sources or other people's money. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law provided unprecedented funding. The tax incentives, certainly folks in Aspen have the tax liability to take advantage of those. To the extent that they really influence people's decisions is an interesting question, because folks in Aspen are often wealthy enough that they want to just get the appliance or the equipment that best serves their vision for how their house should operate. And so the costs and benefits may enter less, the cost and energy savings may enter less into their equation than someone who's more cost constrained. Another interesting thing about federal funding is that Aspen, a small community, no low-income and disadvantaged census tracts as the EPA defines them, so not as competitive as other places for federal grants. No one is coming to save us, no one is gonna give Aspen funding for this at a big scale. That said, there are opportunities where the state is getting funding through the federal government, where other partners might get federal funding, so there may be some opportunities there. But historically, on the grand scale of infrastructure investment in the United States, the federal government has always been a pretty small share of that. It's always been on local and state governments to step into the breach and figure out how they're gonna pay for stuff. And so we're gonna be looking at new local revenue sources, as well as financing mechanisms like green bonds, on-bill tariff financing, heating and cooling as a service. So ways that we can finance, so we can raise the upfront funding and then use energy savings or tax revenues, other sources, to pay that back over time so we can make sure that we actually achieve the goals.
Oh, was that it for that one?
Last slide.
Cool. So what do next steps look like for us? Well, we're really excited to kind of wrap up the study, kind of look into the analysis and where we can see those current costs and then the future expected costs, and kind of dive into those difficult questions, or at least for now, mull them over about those difficult paybacks that we're going to be faced with on some of these essential climate action policies. Then we'll bring this to our council, we'll bring it back to our community, engage them with the results, and then finally, phase 2 of this whole analysis will be to really unpack some of those creative financing options and incentives, and looking into all the different ways that we can unlock these climate action policies.
All right, well, thanks everybody. Thank you for that. So that concludes the presentation, and now I get to be Raleigh and throw this around, and up in the deck, you are out of luck, because I will humiliate myself in 6 different ways if I try to throw this to you. So would anyone like to get us started with questions? Oh, you have a question way back there. Oh, good Lord. I'm just going to hand this to you then. Thank you. Okay.
I maintain this is the coolest thing I've seen at a conference yet. So, I'm from Blaine County in Idaho, so a little different landscape, but I'm curious if you guys have evaluated the administrative burden, whether it be from grant writing, grant administration, or from program administration. Have you evaluated those costs into this assessment?
Yes, so we've worked with the city to estimate the number of full-time equivalents that would be required for each policy, which certainly adds to the cost.
All right. My question is about how you talked about the different dumpsters with a community with denser development. Have you thought about changing your land use code to accommodate multiple dumpsters, maybe in the right of way, maybe in the setbacks, but just sort of thinking about the policy impacts when the planning staff and the quasi regulatory reviews happen of the construction management plans? And if so, any kind of template for that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that is not in our land use or zoning code arena. That is more on our engineering department side that manage our right-of-way and encroachment usage. We are going to be proposing to our council, and we have an agreement with our engineering folks that for the purposes of recycling and separating out materials, we will waive the encroachment fees to use those spaces in the right-of-way to incentivize and alleviate the costs associated with a C&D diversion ordinance. And we also just want to be careful about the impact on the community, so it's not just allowing more dumpsters, but how is the community going to react? And does someone want to walk down a street and see hundreds of dumpsters for the purpose of recycling, and then people start not liking recycling because it equals dumpsters. So that's a careful one we have to walk around.
I've got it over here. Two questions. One is on cost and timing, and the other is on geography. The cost and timing, one of the slides you had up there said it was from the 2020 report. So you're obviously a few years in. How long has it taken you to get to where, and how much cost, whether it's wages for, number of FTEs, like orders of magnitude to get to where you are, and again, costs to go forward? It's a variation on the question. And the other is, my understanding is Aspen as a town, as a city, is what, 1/3 of the population of Pitkin County. So are you trying to work with Pitkin County? Because like so much of your stuff in buildings, but I would think that if you started to include the entire county or the entire Roaring Fork Valley, your transportation numbers would go way up. And are you feeling like you're doing too small a geofencing kind of thing in your efforts?
I can take the second one first. So when it comes to working regionally, that's something everyone on our team values like heavily, because we know, our valley, yes, we are Aspen, the jurisdiction, but really we're a corridor of a workforce, a community that goes all the way down not only the Roaring Fork Valley, but even to the Colorado River Valley. So that I think everybody's on the same page about. What we do about it is we have regional climate groups. We're on regional grants, which has been really cool. We do a lot of meetings with folks in Pitkin County and in other jurisdictions like Salt, Snowmass, Carbondale, et cetera. When it comes to buildings specifically, Pitkin County and us have slightly different challenges, but on the areas where we have the same issues, we can learn from each other, and we often do. So they're heavily residential with actually quite a bit of space to do stuff. So you have you can put transformers, right? You have like extra space around these big houses. So I think when I've talked to their planners and their climate staff, it's really focused on that residential component. And so both of our building codes have caps on exterior energy use. So that's something kind of we're aligned on. And also Kim from Lotus, who did a presentation yesterday, we're on like a regional code cohort to align our building and energy codes, and Pitkin County, as well as people from Garfield County and Eagle County were also part of that cohort, so we can kind of get on the same page. And then also through regional organizations like CORE, Walking Mountains, and Clear, we're able to start looking at economies of scale. So can we start having regional projects around, for example, affordable housing or multifamily housing, so that we're not just like one-off doing little heat pump projects, but we're actually thinking on a landscape scale. So I think that nonprofit partnership and that regional collaboration have allowed that to be possible. The first one, I don't know.
Was the first question in relation to us including? So yeah. So we are using the 2019-2020 greenhouse gas analysis for purposes of this climate action cost analysis. But we are using contemporary costs when we're talking about like the infrastructure or electricity rates or whatever. Yeah, I was thinking kind of.
Well, I guess
methodology.
I think maybe the question is more like, what has it taken to get the City of Aspen to where you are today? Yeah, which we haven't quantified yet, but I would say, like, how big is your sustainability office? You have like 6 people, which is pretty.
Everyone there.
Pretty mind-blowing. Like, so it's been. I don't know if you have like what your annual budget is off the top of your head, but it's significant compared to other places, I would say.
And we've been at it. And we had predecessors, like this team has had different names. It was like the Canary Initiative. Like they've been at it since the early 2000s. Yep. So they've been at it a long time. And so I'm sure if you added up all those costs, it would be significant over time.
I think the box is over here now.
So maybe I misunderstood, but you said that you're taking the BPS cost analysis and feeding that to AECOM. So did I misunderstand the BP? What is the BPS analysis, and then what is AECOM doing? Or did I misunderstand?
No, great question. So for each of our sectors, there's multiple actions that we're analyzing the costs and benefits of. In the building sector, we've got our existing building, which is like BPS or Building IQ, and then we've got our new building policies. So AECOM from the jump has been taking the cost benefit analysis of the new building policies, but we already had this partnership with the national labs who already are doing cost-benefit analyses on BPS policies. So it was basically a cost savings. Like they're doing it and they're already expert at it, and they've been doing it for tons of cities that are part of our national Building Performance Standard Technical Assistance Network. So it was really just kind of finding an efficiency by using labs that are already do those cost analyses all the time. So AECOM is still doing some of the analysis on some building actions. It's just this one policy. We kind of farmed out the analysis that then they'll take back, look at those numbers, and provide funding options, because the national labs don't do that. They don't tell you how to pay for it. They'll just tell you how much it costs.
And I thought I saw a hand up towards the middle. But someone else is in charge. That's good.
Hi guys, thank you. So I guess I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the timeline that you have so far for each action. Are you seeing like very different timelines, or are you trying to keep them consistent? Like the example that I'm thinking about is the city of Ann Arbor, for example, when they did their cost analysis, they're just keeping it at 10 years for every single action. So I'm just curious, like, what does that look like for you guys?
So we're trying to reflect a timeline that is as close as possible to what we think the city's policy implementation is going to look like. So we've worked with Tim, Ainsley, and Clare for each action to try to align our assumptions with the ordinances or the plans as closely as we can. And then we're looking at the benefits, like long-term costs through 2050.
I think, yeah, the analysis is ongoing as well, and so we'll look at like the technological improvements that happen over time, or we expect to see incrementally throughout 2050, and so those have been we've been able to create sort of those incremental milestones within the analysis as well.
And in the actions we picked, they're kind of the near-term priorities. So we have some ones that we're excited about, we'd love to do, from the waste hauler stuff that the rest of the team mentioned earlier to the embodied carbon work, but we've kind of focused on the first thing first.
And I would say, like, I think that's one of the smartest decisions that you all made, because we're going to end up with numbers that are like hard to get our arms around, but it's not going to be as shocking as if we took the entire Aspen Sustainability Action Plan and costed out everything. First of all, that would entail so many uncertainties and assumptions, because the farther out the action is, the more uncertainty, like we don't know. Technology is going to change. So many things are going to change. So focusing on those short-term actions has allowed us to, one, go deeper and really say, like, when is this going to happen? What is it going to take? How many full-time equivalents is it going to require? That will, in turn, inform the policy and like make for a stronger policy-making process. And my hope is that it also results in numbers that are politically more actionable, because they're not frightening, but they are providing the reality that people want to make good decisions.
Could I interrupt with a follow-up on that? Sorry, I'm going to throw them off. Since you're talking about scope and you're talking about cost, can you talk about the discussions that we had over the question of utilities and rates, and that going beyond the scope of, you know, I, the homeowner, I, the building owner, yeah, here's what's going to cost me in my building for this particular equipment, but then there's the utility costs and their infrastructure. Can you talk about how the study is addressing that?
Okay, I'll start and you guys can add on. So one of the cost estimators who we work with, who has this amazing British accent, and so everything he says is so smart, he says that when you do a cost analysis, you have to put a fence around it, because if you try to make it too big, you could just keep going forever, and eventually you're like costing everything to everyone all the time. And so we did have to put a fence around our analysis. We're looking really at the most direct measurable costs. For building and transportation electrification, we're not looking at transformer costs, because those are so hard to predict. Often you don't know what they are until you go to the utility and you're like ready to plug in, and then all of a sudden you're hit with a surprise transformer cost. We're not looking at the, you know, what are the long-term implications of if we electrify buildings and transportation, we need to expand the utilities' capacity to deliver electricity, like what are long-term rates going to be? That opens up a huge number of policy questions. All the way down to like what will our future rates look like, and what will the policy considerations be when we set them. And so as Claire mentioned, instead of, you know, we weren't able to take all that on at once, And so instead, we've laid out a roadmap for what would those future analyses look like for the city to be able to have conversations with their utilities about what are appropriate next steps to widen the ring of the fence, open the gate, if you will.
Thanks. And actually, I can't see where the box is. Is it still there? There, go ahead.
Thank you. Traditionally, public works have been correlated via exactions, taxes, and fees to the choices we make as consumers. I was heartened to hear earlier in your presentation that perhaps outdoor gas-powered grills might be subject to fees that are specifically earmarked for carbon offsets. But why in general, at a broad level, in your opinion, do progressive mountain towns, why are we so reluctant to use the powerful, potent tools we have in this toolbox? To contextualize the question, from a list of a dozen examples of funding mechanisms that would raise significant amounts of money, I'd like to mention 4 examples. Adding a fixed carbon offset fee to the purchase of ski lift passes. Loading landing fees for private jets. The idea being that vastly larger amounts of carbon are released into the atmosphere that could be saved had those individuals chosen to use commercial carriers. Adding a fixed one-time carbon emissions fee to the cost of registering gas-powered recreational vehicles like snowmobiles, dirt bikes, power boats, all-terrain vehicles, etc. Correlating electricity and natural gas household unit costs to how much is used. The idea being to adopt a sliding scale of energy unit costs that are linked to simple variables like home sizes or the number of bedrooms, and also in a program like this, rewarding those who use less energy than the average, offering rebates. The nexus for some of these are constrained by rules at the state and federal levels, but we know in the context of exactions and impact fees that have for long been applied to the choices that developers make when they finance or want to build a subdivision. There's a legal justification for those kinds of funding tools, and there's quite a long list of options. Why aren't we the most progressive communities in the country based on our relationship to our natural settings using more of these tools?
I think we can steal some of those and add them to our
I
list.
totally agree. I want to get your list.
Your list seems really legit. But do you want to
talk about the REMP first? Because I think that was the first part of the question. Like, you do have the...
Yeah, we do. So I can't really speak to why people don't, because we do. And a lot of our neighbors have it similarly. I feel like people in the Eagle Valley. Cameron, you can nod. I think Vail. No? Okay. There's other people in like our regional area that do similar things. So I think there has been appetite in our region for renewable energy mitigation programs. It's called something slightly different down valley of us, and I forget what it's called. But what is it called? Energy offset.
External energy offset.
Okay. So there has been appetite. So I can't really speak to why there wouldn't be, but that program has been really successful in funding not only our team's work, but the work of the Community Office of Resource Efficiency, or CORE. So I think just seeing real community benefit when you paid it for something, that it's like, it's real, it's tactile, it's people you know, that might be a reason that it has support.
And I would also say, like, from our conversations with Aspen Electric, they are really thinking in a deep way about rates and equity and who should pay how much, both from an equity perspective and from a fairness a fairness in terms of use perspective.
Yeah, they have a tiered rate structure, which is pretty cool. So the more you use, you get jumped up in the pyramid and you pay more, which is really cool. Yeah.
Okay.
I can't see. Are there any more questions out there? Yes, go ahead. I don't know if we have a box. Thanks. And thank you to the assistants, volunteers bringing the box around.
So I had a question on the enforcement side of it. So with your ordinances, who's responsible for enforcing them? And then how difficult has it been to either get the data as a result of the policies? And then I have a couple more questions on just the process with the public and getting engagement. And through that process, have you had a lot of pushback on the ordinances, and how did you resolve that? And I'm thinking just in particular with like the Building IQ program, we had reached out to our real estate industry to gauge their thoughts on benchmarking for buildings in Mountain Village, Colorado, and they were not keen on the idea. So how did you kind of work through some of those challenges?
Sure. Do you want to talk a little bit about progressive enforcement, and then I can talk about Building IQ?
Sure. I'll talk about the organics enforcement. So for our policy that prohibits the landfilling of organics, it's targeting the restaurants right now because they are the largest producer of organic waste. And it's been more of a progressive approach rather than we're policing you, we're ticketing you. It's, hi, we're here to help. What challenges do you have in your restaurant, and what can we provide you for support as the city? So a lot of more educational and friendly tactics rather than making them afraid of us and then like shying away from having assistance, because we want these policies to work. We don't want people to shy away from us and think we're like the big bad city here to enforce. So that's for organics specifically, but then also if we hear from people in the community, like we'll get calls all the time just about different regulations we have in place. And then we have like an enforcement, a couple of enforcement officers between different departments that go out in the field, investigate what's going on, and like start with a conversation rather than a ticket.
And then on the Building IQ side, that resonates. Buildings can be tricky. There can be pushback. I think success has happened in a couple ways here. So the first thing is having a phased approach. So the way we passed Building IQ was we're gonna have a phased approach benchmarking, so it's not everybody at first. It was first commercial buildings, 20,000 square feet and greater, and city-owned buildings, and then it kind of grabbed people in over time, so now we're doing commercial, city, and multifamily buildings. So I think that's one strategy, is kind of slow roll. Another part of that is wraparound support. So we're really fortunate with our partnership with CORE. In our Building IQ program, they literally do it for everybody. It's pretty awesome. Even for our commercial buildings, 20,000 square feet and greater, they gave them all a free assessment. And so it was kind of a why not for the building owners and kind of that sector, I'd call it like the development, construction sector. It really helped them. They were getting free recommendations. Even some of our building owners, we've partnered to get more data. We've like partnered to do some ASHRAE Level 2 studies, and we purposely picked some of the people that were the most anti the policy. We're like, let's work together. Like, let's see if we can find you some great things to do with your building. I know your boiler is gonna break. Like, let's work together at this point of need. So I think providing wraparound support through a trusted community partner, and it not always being the town, but in partnership, I think has been more effective. And we've hedged. Not every community that does benchmarking does that. I don't think it's like necessarily the right way. Like the state of Colorado has a much more hands-off approach. That's because they have to. They're doing thousands of buildings. But we took the opportunity of like, we have a small town. Let's actually go meet the building owners face to face. So each of them has had a site visit and talks with CORE and talks with us. And I think that has broken down some barriers and walls that are definitely have been there. And I imagine we'll still be there for a while in different degrees because of different costs. On the building performance standards side, again, taking that phased approach has been really helpful. And also kind of, I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but our team always talks about moving at the speed of trust. And I think that that's been like the best strategy for building performance standard. I was supposed to and would have liked to pass it like a year ago with guidelines and ready to go. And then we realized, we're like, okay, we've got to bring people along with us on this journey. And so we've had very, very in-depth stakeholder engagement and doing things like doing audits with building owners to kind of get them on board and get real costs for them so that we can kind of ideate and figure out what is the spectrum of policies that could work in our context, and ensuring people we're not going to copy paste something from a city context that can't work here. And so that's been helpful, just hearing people, listening to people, phased approach, and then definitely community partnership for that wraparound support.
yearly for them for free to do the benchmarking, or is it like the first year they get the assessment, they do the benchmarking, and then their property managers or whoever is responsible for the data is then tasked with doing that in future years?
So they get the support every year. They don't get an assessment every year, but what we do have is every building gets an individualized something called a scorecard. So it like pumps out a couple of key recommendations based on their energy and water use. Also, we benchmark energy and water use, so it's kind of like get it all at once. And that's been really helpful. So some key recommendations. Also, it's a small town, so like because we're using community partners, they probably already know what's going on in that building. Like, so there's some ways you can find efficiencies to understand what's going on in the building and what kind of recommendations they need. And as every year you benchmark, it does just become easier because especially for some of the new utility software that we have, if they give consent, their utility data is automatically uploading to Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So once it goes once and you have the whole thing where you have to like find their email address and like that whole upstart, which is like a whole thing, then it flywheels. It kind of goes on itself. And you've built that trust. You've built that literal like API or technical ease of getting the data, and it makes it a little bit easier.
And Claire, am I right that the core wraparound services are largely funded by the Renewable Energy Mitigation Program, the REMP, so that fee on exterior energy use? So just like it all comes full circle within this discussion. Because you need the funding source in order to have those services.
And I would just add that like if you do want to do a benchmarking program, I think it's just you have to weigh the trade-offs. Like you can do it way cheaper, but if you're not also trying to pass other policies, that might not be the best method because you're not building buy-in and relationship while you do it. Or you can do it like full wraparound, help them benchmark, go look at their boilers, and that's more labor and cost intensive. But I think upfront, it's been really worth it to build buy-in.
Great, we've got just a couple minutes left. Did anyone else have questions? I see one in the back, and would anyone in the balcony want to shout out a question? Or are you guys okay up there? All right, we've got you in the back. Box is coming your way. Maybe you get the last word.
Just a quick follow-up. I know you said you weren't planning on sharing any specific numbers from the study, and those are maybe preliminary at this point, but do you have a sense, just kind of high level, of what this assessment reflects, the cost of your capital implementation for these major projects reflects as a percentage of your overall city budget? Is this like in the 5% realm? Is it like 30%? Do you have a sense of how that lays out? So I think that'd be helpful as a comparison for other communities.
I think that's a great point, and we'll put it in the final report. I don't know right now, no.
Well, and I think it's actually an interesting way that you pose the question, because you're asking for a comparison of what it's going to cost compared to the city budget. And I don't think that there's a contemplation that this money is going to come from the city budget.
It's not all certainly going to come from the city budget, some portion of it. And I think the conversation that will be had is what portion of it and what other funding sources will we need. So I think it would be a really useful point of comparison, but we're talking about like community-wide fleet electrification. And the city's certainly not going to pay for all of that. So I think it'd be interesting to compare as a metric, but it won't tell the full story.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, you guys. Hey, I'm wondering where kind of like a line is drawn when you're saying we sometimes, and it's like, you have a municipal utility, I think. And so like my community, we have an investor-owned utility, and so I don't know, like, is the REMP thing a municipal utility? Is that like a utility side, city side thing? When you say we're paying for it, is that like, I'm just trying to figure out like how much is kind of like, because you have a municipal utility, you can do these things. Does that make sense? Because we don't have that, and I'm trying to like figure out like how much of the being a municipal utility is allowing you to take on some of these things like BPS and like all these building things.
I can start, and then Tim, you can add. I think just to be clear, our municipal utility only is about like half. So we also have a co-op, so we have Holy Cross Energy, does everybody else. So it isn't just like kind of a one-for-one. And it certainly helps that they work near us so that we can go talk to them. But the funding that we're talking about is mostly separate from that. Do you want to add on?
That was actually the point I was going to make. Yeah.
Great, perfect. We literally 5 seconds. So you did great. Thank you so much for coming out, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, Aspen.